So the goal of this session is to get into the nitty-gritty a little bit of what it actually means to develop for VR. So we've got a fascinating selection of panelists to take us through some of the foundational aspects of what it's like to actually develop for VR. So we've got Peter from Resolution Games, who's going to talk about what it's like to develop for a medium where a user has no expectations. Bradley from BBC is going to talk about transitioning the brand and keeping kind of the brand integrity into a new medium. And then Kai from ARTE is going to talk about this much talked about dichotomy or interrelation between linear and interactive experiences. So coming up, guys. And Peter, over to you with the first lightning talk that you're going to take us through.
So, first I'm going to look over there. Okay. Hi, I'm Peter. I work at Resolution Games. We're based in Stockholm, Sweden. And when we develop games in virtual reality now, we like to start in reality and then try to bring the things that are interesting into fantastic. An example of that is one of our games. We had the fortune to be one of the launching titles for Daydream, and it's called Wonderglade, and it's basically doing something familiar in an unfamiliar context. So the example from Wonderglade, that is that shooting hoops, throwing a basketball is very familiar, and you can't trick the brain. You gotta make it feel like you're throwing that basketball. But you're doing it on the moon. That's kind of unfamiliar. So that's what we found really interesting and what the players liked the most. Yeah.
Awesome. Bradley?
Great. Thank you. I'm Bradley from BBC Worldwide. So sometimes when a new kind of technology comes along, it's really tempting to kind of get caught up in what that technology can do for you and maybe to forget some of the things that make your brand what it is. And you should be thinking about the things that make your brand what it is. And they might be as practical as the kind of like the logos that you use or the color schemes that you use and so on. But beyond that, there should be other things in terms of kind of like the brand values, the things that kind of represent your brand at a very kind of like high level. And really, when you're taking your brand into a new media like VR, you need to be rigorously applying those kind of, those sort of checks and processes when you sort of you take your brand into a new medium. And to give you an example, we're doing a lot of work at the moment with our BBC Earth brand, so it's natural history content. Some of you might be familiar with this. One of the last things that we did was called Planet Earth 2. There's a scene in that where there's iguanas versus snakes. We call these kind of iconic scenes. And these are something that we tend to have always when we put out our kind of what we call landmark series each year. But really, this is just underpinning the kind of brand values that make up what BBC Earth is all about. So those brand values are things like the editorial and scientific rigor. We make sure that everything we do in whatever medium is rigorous in terms of its application of the science that we apply. Probably the biggest and most important thing is also storytelling. That's something that in everything that we do, and if you think about it, that kind of iguanas versus kind of snakes example is a good example of storytelling, right? And that's something that we want to carry through into all of the kind of like the media that we do and all the content that we produce. So that's something that we're thinking about when we're creating VR experiences. And finally, and this is easy with VR, we're thinking about innovation. So that doesn't necessarily come to mind when you're thinking about BBC natural history content, but actually, every time a new series comes out, we're using new technology. We're either using new cameras, we're using drones to take pictures, or we're using new submersible techniques. And again, we want to carry through that kind of brand value into VR. So the types of things, the types of kind of content that we're delivering, the way in which people interact and so on, we want to innovate with.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, that's me, Kai from ARTE. Our trigger for VR at ARTE was really that it's something, it's a medium which attracts the interest of all generations. I mean, from kids to grandparents, everybody is attracted by VR and is fascinated by that. But to get and to keep this interest for VR productions, we started now in 2014, I think, with the first one. Is really a key question is really the interface and the accessibility. So interacting in VR should be close to human behavior, as easy as breathing or drinking water. It should be really easy to seamlessly get into VR, and also the same for augmented reality for some projects we're working on. I would like to show you two examples how we distinguish the things a bit. I mean, one is that we do a lot of more linear productions based on 360 video, but also added with metadata, which is, for instance, Dolphin a series, a VR series we just published. So we take people to exceptional places and to give access to exceptional places. In this example, you can really dive with free divers more than 5 meters, 10, 20 meters, 50 meters down in the ocean. You can swim with dolphins and stuff like that, and sperm whales. So something exceptional, you cannot live like that out of the box. And the second one is more interactive experiences, but also with the same goal to be really seamless in terms of navigation. That's Notes on Blindness. It's the story of a British man who lost sight, and he did an audio journal about it. And the fascinating thing with this audio journal is that he really explains extremely interesting what happens to him. So we did a VR experience with our French partners about it, and it's extremely interesting. After you saw it, you understand what it means to lose sight. And the interactive part in that is just based on the way you move with sound, with different things like that. You don't need to click on something or anything. It's just seamless into the whole experiences. So these are the goals we are working on, and we're working on more in VR.
Cool, thank you. So super amazing to have such a wide cross-section of developers in the room, and I think probably let's make this practical, right? So we've got developers here who are perhaps thinking of getting into VR, and with that, what would be the number one piece of advice that you'd give to someone who is thinking of starting out in VR today? Bradley, what would you say?
That's a good question. I think, I've always sort of said, go in with your eyes open, quite literally maybe. It's not an easy kind of medium to develop for at first. There's quite a steep learning curve. Our first foray into it, we sort of thought, this will be relatively easy. We'll crack a couple of kind of experiences out there and get them through submission. And everything took 3 times as long, cost 3 times as much as we were expecting. And actually, to kind of go back to my point I was making before, to uphold the things that are important to us about our brand, like the quality of the output and so on, actually took a significant amount of time. And I think it's only really just now that we've really kind of learnt how to approach that properly and sort of do things in the right way. And that will be a sort of continuing learning process as sort of new tech comes out and so on.
So what would you say then in that sense to someone who's just thinking of starting out, or any of you guys that have a good piece of wisdom in terms of the first thing to think about or the first potential failure that you have to think about in terms of developing for VR?
I would say start with the core, start simple. One of my developers usually says, throw crap on the wall and see what sticks. And you got to try. You got to try a lot of things because it's a moving platform. It's a moving target that you're aiming for. So you try, and come back to the things that just feels good.
I think knowing what your objectives are, you have an end goal. What are you actually trying to achieve with this? Are you trying to do this from a commercial point of view? Are you trying to do it from a brand point of view? What are your objectives? And that's probably true of most ventures, right? But I think it's particularly true with something which combines a lot of creativity and a lot of tech. So it is, like you say, it's a kind of a moving target, and sometimes it moves whilst you're developing for it, right? Exactly. So yeah, I think it's good to have an end goal in mind.
I think it's also extremely interesting, important to work on ideas in a way that you have an idea and you can put it in one sentence and you pitch it to someone and it makes click. And I think that's a key factor in the beginning, and then you add the tech to it. But if you have this kind of basic idea which really convinces people, and it convinces a little boy of 5 years or a granny of 90, then you think you know that you're really working on something interesting and great, and which can be really great. And then you add the tech, you add the different ways of sound, of cameras, of Unity, whatever. You decide what you want to use for it. And that's, I think, a key factor.
That's great. I mean, I think one interesting mantra that we all know in kind of mobile world is fail cheap and fail fast. And I just want to kind of drill down on that a little bit in the context of this question as well. It kind of works in mobile pretty well. Like you can, fail cheap and fail fast. With VR and the costs and the know-how associated with developing for VR, that's presumably a lot harder to do. So how do you still apply the same method, or do you just not, and you see this as an investment of a different kind, and you have to convince perhaps your leadership that this is just the way it has to be? Peter, do you have a take on that?
Yeah, I guess there was the crap on the wall and see what's taken. Yeah, it does apply, I think, partially. I think you have to make a few bets. I think you got to pick a few things that you actually believe is going to happen. Like, for example, we believe that chords in VR are going to go away. You're going to be moving around a lot more. There's a lot of those examples where you got to go, that we really believe in is going to happen, because, again, it's a moving platform. It does apply in the sense that if you got to do something that you are very unsure of, that if it's going to be successful or not, then yeah, fail fast.
I think it's also important to be flexible in a way that you can port your experience to different other platforms, to do real-life experiences in cinemas, to bring it on mobile, to bring it on different headsets and stuff like that. I mean, that can really trigger the evolution, and it can help that with porting you redefine the things you're doing. So I think it's really amazing to see that things are working great on Daydream, but also on Android. But on Android, then on us also some other headsets and stuff like that. But still, we can show it in planetariums, in screens which are 30-meter large, and you can watch it together with 300 people in a cinema-like setting. So I think that's really the interesting, great thing with VR today, that you are on a step into something new, and everybody's trying out, and then as many as different ways you try out, then I think you will succeed in the one or the other.
By the way, if anyone has a question in the audience, feel free to raise your hand, and we'll give you a mic or something, or just ask. Yep. Martin, just over there.
Hello, I'm Martin. I'm in company for Cygic. We have a division called Cygic Travel, and we have already more than 3,000 VR videos in our platform, so almost reaching 5,000 in a few months. And we still have the struggle, I would say, like the classical TV or video approach, to have the passive watching of the videos in 360 or virtual reality content, comparing to active. So what is your point of view to bring more, if it's the way to bring more active interaction with video, or we are now in Android platform with the new generation on Oculus. We'll be ready in a few weeks, and then we have Samsung VR presence in our channel. So what is your approach to bring more customers to really passive, to see the content and to be entertained by the content, or to go more to interact with the content in VR world? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, it's an interesting question, because there's, different parts of the BBC are doing different things. We're doing kind of, obviously, if people are interested in sort of live streaming e-sports through kind of, VR and so on. There's a big kind of divide, I think, between 360 content and real-time content, and, obviously, there's a certain amount that you can do to overlay one or the other. I think in everything you create, again, thinking of kind of what, what the end goal is, you need to be adding value. I think one of the problems that VR has had is, and it's the same with most kind of new techs, is people go, wow, there's this amazing new thing, let's build some stuff for it, okay? Not necessarily thinking if this is something that the audience actually wants. And I think you have to be thinking in any product development, who's my audience? What do they need? What can I offer them? And if you can answer those three things, and that allows you to come up with a product which is going to make their life easier or more entertaining or whatever it is, then I think you'll be successful. But I think just doing something because you hope the market will develop, I think that's risky, very risky. So I think it's really key to kind of, you know, to be thinking of your consumer always, what's going to be good for them, if that answers your question. Yeah.
Kai, you probably have a point of view on that since you spoke about linear and interactive.
I think the real interactive is still based on mobile. It's based on VR headsets, and we see a growth that there are more and more headsets on the market. So the kind of market is getting bigger and bigger. Still, with linear, you have the advantage that you can really make access to people who don't have a headset. But who are familiar with video in general, so they understand it like that. And I think if you create out of that great experiences that can be a bit more convincing, just to understand this new evolutionary step into computing, and this kind of new platform, this kind of new interactive realities coming up there. And it's a really good tool, like a technology that's kind of doing the bridge between the two, and that's why we shouldn't underestimate really linear-based videos.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that quickly, from the Daydream side, we've seen that actually the most used app on Daydream is YouTube. So, like linear 360 video is playing a big part, and I don't think we want to say that 360 or linear video is some kind of a step towards the ultimate goal, which is interactive. It's not. Like, I think, as Bradley mentioned, it's really about what you're trying to achieve, and sometimes 360 video is exactly the right format. And also, it's, you know, often cheaper to produce, so that's a good thing too. I think there was another question from the gentleman here.
Hi, hello. Hey. I'm Antoine. I work at Pursue. We're a language learning app, and we've just built a VR experience for another platform. And one of my questions is around replayability, because obviously those experiences are quite finite. And I guess as all platforms, we'll be looking at retention as a key metric. So how do you make sure that you know, the headset just doesn't become one thing that's just left in the cupboard, out of view, and, you know, people come back to your experiences over time?
I would start by saying, sorry. As I said, placing the bets before in what you believe will happen, you know, in time to come. I personally believe that we're not quite there yet. There's a cap. There's an experience cap, which is, you know, that's sad, but it's going to come. Like, technology is moving extremely fast. And I think, yeah, you gotta be there when it goes relevant, I think. You gotta be ready when putting that thing on, and whatever happens in that reality feels relevant to you. And also, you got to place those bets on what you believe is relevant to your target audience. For example, a group of young people might want to meet up and play their favorite game, and so forth. And you might want to meet with your son or your daughter across the world, different groups.
Yeah, I mean, there's some BBC research actually that was done recently about the kind of barriers. You might have seen it. It's really interesting, and one of the biggest barriers is that people lose their headsets. So, you know, it's a different thing to kind of like, you know, switch on your TV and interact with content that way, to actually go and find your headset, put it on, go through the kind of process of sort of booting it up and so on. And the research found that was one of the most difficult things about VR, is that people tend to do things in order of how easy they are. And VR comes fairly sort of low down the kind of list. And that's one reason why I think it has to have that added value. It has to be something that kind of like, people are going to kind of want as a destination to kind of go to. But I do think as well, we were just talking about this before, that we are in the really early stages of VR. There's been a huge amount of noise about it, and people are saying, oh, it's not going to work, and people aren't investing in it and so on. It's incredibly unfair because it's only really been in its current form around for 18 months to 2 years. If you look at the mobile market, which has been around for a long, long time, much of the sophistication about kind of retention and so on is only really now kind of coming to kind of like the fore, and you look at the way that kind of mobile companies sort of re-engage people and so on. That's sort of, years of kind of R&D and investment and tying into social channels and so on. And I think VR and AR will have that eventually as well, and that will help with kind of retention and getting people to come back in and discoverability and all those things.
Yeah, it's an interesting comparison to mobile because actually the first mobile or smartphones, they came to market in the 90s, something like that, but it made boom in the 2000s with Android, with iOS and stuff like that. So there was quite a big period in between the first really market phones like the Nokia back in the days and stuff like that. I think that seeing VR moving today, since like 2014, since we do it, is really fast. I think I'm quite surprised in different levels, I mean, in adoption and stuff like that. But I think also that the midterm or the next goal would be that it's kind of something, which is where people ask for experiences, but not because it's VR, because they ask that they heard something is really great and they want to play it or they want to see it or whatever. I think that will be the next goal for the next year.
Yeah, I think that to your question around replayability, there's kind of, I think, three things that need to happen and align in a certain way, which is hardware, software, and content, right? So if the barrier to experiencing VR is a lot lower, then replayability is not really that much of an issue because you can just pick this thing up and it's cheap and it's easy, right? And I think to follow on with this, one interesting, stat that I guess you guys know is that, Goldman Sachs says by 2025, VR will become an $80 billion industry, taking over TV. That's interesting. What do you, be that as it may, what do you think are the key steps that need to happen in order for VR to go mainstream, whatever that means?
I think we have if you look back on smartphone market, I mean, today you have a phenomenon that people say they talk to someone, but you don't know how. I mean, did they call them? Did they write a WhatsApp? Whatever, you don't know. They just say that they are in communication with someone. And I think VR should be, and AR should be at the same level, more or less, that it's used intuitively, like, okay, it's there, it's something. And I do a call with my friends in the States in 360, and I see where they are, and we can share the environment and stuff like that. So all this, I think, will come. But I think this will be more or less the kind of level where it will arrive.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an interesting kind of like adoption curve with any new technology, that it has to become sort of, it has to be accessible to people and sort of be something that kind of people are familiar with. And obviously, as a younger generation grows up with that tech, they're kind of, they'll probably be more willing to kind of put kind of headsets on and so on. But again, I think it just comes down to kind of like, what are the applications going to be? And I think you'll probably begin to see VR finding different areas which it's really good at. So I think it has lots of applications for kind of business to business and training and that type of thing. I think there'll be a lot more installation-based VR coming up in the next couple of years. You'll see it at theme parks, you'll see it in kind of malls and things like that. And I think that, again, will kind of like, give the general public much more exposure to it. And that's a good way for them getting involved, because it's not them doing that at home and losing their headset or whatever.
Great. Awesome. Okay, I think we're all out of time. So thank you so much for joining and discussing. Super interesting. So yeah, thank you.